Sorry. Welcome to Ethics at Almost One, not new. Let's welcome Iddan to give a presentation on what exactly is the freedom problem of work.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Okay, yes, today we're going to talk about freedom in work. And, I think many of us kind of like hold an intuition that something about the way we work, our institutions of work, doesn't implement liberty in an ideal manner. People around us, whether more blue collar and more white collar, there is something in the way work is arranged that is, again, kind of like somehow deficient in terms of freedom. And it's also like a claim that like a proposition that appears frequently in political theory and political philosophy, sometimes kind of like taken as a given even without like being justified much. And like obviously like this claim, and I would just say kind of like an important parenthesis, I'm going to talk today about freedom and work kind of like in the context of like rich developed economies, which I think still kind of like raise such intuitions, like kind of like applying some of the arguments I'm going to talk about today to more developing, least developed, poor nations is like kind of like not going to work, like raises a host of complications. Like we're going to talk kind of like about the privileged freedom problem of work, which I think is still important and kind of like also going to be relevant to nations that become richer over time. So kind of like in this context of like advanced market economies, like there are like pretty obvious like complications to trying to argue that work violates freedom. Obviously, like work is done today through like voluntary contracts that we kind of like consider as maybe kind of like the epitome of like doing things in kind of like in concert in a way that doesn't compromise liberty in a liberal worldview. And also kind of like, it's already in the book of Genesis, we kind of like consider work as kind of like the curse of human beings. It's something that we kind of like need to do. It's not easy to kind of like maintain our physical body, and like things that are necessary. It's kind of like their freedom status is kind of like complicated. It's not so easy to say about things that we kind of like have to do that, not because we kind of like forced by other people to deem them as freedom problematic. So we need to give some sort of like more sophisticated philosophical articulation of like trying to argue that there is like a freedom problem in the work around us. Now, philosophers kind of like try to do that. So what I'm going to do in the talk today is to first survey, like extract like the main kind of like answers to this question we can find in kind of like recent philosophical literature, kind of like argue that all of them are somewhat unsatisfactory, and then kind of like in the second half of the talk to kind of like try to give like an alternative direction of thought that I do think kind of like capture some sort of freedom problem in the way kind of like market work happens. So I think like a good gateway will be kind of like what we can call workplace Republicans. So like Elizabeth Anderson's book, Private Government, is probably like the most kind of like notable articulation here. Basically, and they give like a pretty direct answer to this question of like what is the freedom problem of work. What the workplace Republicans try to claim is that when we sign contracts in market economy, because of the dynamism that like markets require, we never know in advance, like the contracts are always kind of like open-ended. We don't know in advance what exactly we're going to do. So what we actually sign is not an agreement to do like a particular set of actions that we know of in advance, but we kind of like sign into being some sort of like instrument that is kind of like dynamically kind of like moved around by a manager, by a boss. So we kind of like spend our day not being able to kind of like confidently self-conduct ourselves. So kind of like there is a manager that can always in kind of like unexpected or unexplained ways intervene in our actions. And that's kind of like, according to them, kind of like violates our freedom intuitions, like Republican freedom, non-interference, etc. Now, is the freedom problem of work about managers, about bosses? For sure, like there is no doubt that what Anderson, etc., point word. It's like normatively significant, people kind of like are minutely controlled by a boss for hours. There is kind of like normatively unsatisfying about that. For sure, like managers can abuse their kind of like contract powers, but like I will say that those like hierarchy, managerial, industrial organization, like kind of like characteristics of the workplace, not really going to give us the answer. And kind of like quickly, I'm gonna give like 3 quick reasons for why we need like a more structural argument, kind of like not only to zero in on the workplace, but we need like a more structural account of what happens generally in labor markets in order to have like kind of like a satisfying theory of like what can be like a freedom problem of work. So the first one is pretty obvious. Like many people today don't really have managers. Like we are living in like an economy that sees like a rising portion of like contract workers, gig economy workers. And if our kind of like language about freedom of work is kind of like anchored in bosses, we're just gonna not have the language to kind of like analyze their situation. And often we find these workers kind of like to be some of the worst normatively, and definitely not kind of like out of the normative problem of works that we want to kind of like have language for. I will also say that like the way usually workplace Republicans talk about resolving this freedom of problem of work is to have kind of like some sort of workplace democracy, right? So there are no manager, there is like a work council or something like that. And I think that like even if we have like kind of like an institutional arrangement like that, this will still not align perfectly with our freedom intuition. So consider like quick like intuition pump that I will also go back to later. So consider the case of Cristiano. Okay, Cristiano is working in the US in a little factory for manufacturing American footballs. Okay, but Cristiano is really not interested in like American football. He doesn't like American footballs, but still he kind of like spends the day doing that. And like the factory has gone through some sort of like the workers unionized, they seized the means of production. It's now like a workplace democracy. Still like what the market kind of like, the factory wants to raise revenue in order to kind of like pay wages and kind of like sustain the workers. What the competitive advantage of this factory in this location is kind of like capable of competitively producing is American footballs. So, even though Cristiano's going every day to the little kind of like meeting, tries to sometimes say, okay, let's do like, I don't know, British footballs and not like American football. Like they just know that they cannot do it in a competitive manner. I think we will still kind of like consider Cristiano to not enjoying like kind of like an ideal institutions of freedom. And also already the argument has kind of like structural angle, right? Because you need to somehow reinforce if there is a problem between in the relationship between the worker and the manager, like you need to be able that there is to say that there is some problem with the exit option of the worker, right? Because if you can just leave this like contract agreement that's like non-ideal, then like even in kind of like textbook Republican theory, there is no problem with that. So the workplace Republicans, they try to say it's very hard to leave the workplace. It's subjectively costly. Under some kind of like compares it to moving from like one dictatorship to another. You have no doubt, and then you have no choice but to take some work. But they don't really kind of like super flesh out this like structural component. So we need to kind of like have a good understanding of this structural component. Now some more, we will call them like radical Republicans, do try to give this more structural account. We will get to them in a second. But before that, I think that to understand the more radical Republicans, we need to look at another candidate for the possible answer from the literature. I think that this argument that I will call the argument for privatization kind of like quite significantly inspires the radical Republicans. It's a little simpler, so it will be easy to kind of like look at it. I think deem it is kind of like unsatisfactory on its own. And then we can move on to kind of like the normative remain of the structural Republicans and kind of like see whether they manage to kind of like add on to it something that will make the argument satisfying. Spoiler, I think that they don't really. So the argument for privatization can be kind of like traced back to some things. Marx say there is like a coin articulation in some. You can say recently there is like Wiederke's like quite fleshed out articulation. So what the argument basically says is through privatization, capitalist governments prevent us from accessing the natural resources that can allow subsistence and tell us to find subsistence through work in the capitalist systems. This means that government tell us to work in the capitalist system or to die, because we cannot gain subsistence. And of course, like such offers of these kinds are like coercive, they violate our freedom. So our work in the capitalist systems is forced or coerced and violates and kind of like is a result or manifestation of unfreedom. Does this argument work? I would say that not really, for two main reasons. One of them is kind of like an empirical reason, but it's also kind of like being bolstered by a more basic, more fundamental, like theoretical problem, analytic problem. So empirically, there is the problem that this is not really like a correct description anymore of like what happens in advanced economies. You can come up with like, for sure, like many criticisms of the modern welfare state. It doesn't like live up to all of the functions that it should fulfill. It can do more, but it does do like some work in kind of like preventing like starvation. It's not really something that we kind of like see around us, but that's like still like if you read a lot of the people, a lot of the philosophers that like write about freedom and work today, they kind of like still anchor a lot of what they say on like starvation. So like I think that there is like a problem with with this kind of like empirical assumption. That's not only for the welfare state. I think it also kind of like relates to what kind of like enables the welfare state, which is like a tremendous amount of wealth that was not there when kind of like Marx came up with kind of like an argument like that. So, I think that if you want to subsist, the type of kind of like work that you need to take, again, just to subsist, it's just kind of like not the type of work that really triggers our unfreedom intuitions, right? So, of course, like problems of freedom also can kind of like move to the extent of the time we are unfree. So, like, I think that only to gain, again, like just subsistence, you can do that by taking, I don't know, like one shift of like, I don't know, like waiting job nowadays, something like that. And again, like even if it does raise like a problem of freedom, it's kind of like a pretty diminished like problem of freedom. And I think again, like the way our intuitions work, usually when we think about like a person who's unfree in the labor system, we think about people that kind of like put a lot of like a big part of their life into their work, and not exactly kind of like the hustler that does like whatever they need to do in order to gain some bucks here and there. Like again, like we can think like as a critical case, like think about in the US, maybe kind of like again, like the critical case for a state in which people in poverty cannot live kind of like out of like state support. Even in the States, you can see like kind of like an increased like empirically documented phenomena of like people that simply like kind of like drop out of the labor force. Many times kind of like young men, they got like some sort of like combination of like minimal amount of money through some welfare, maybe their family, some specific past gigs that again I don't think really interfere with our freedom intuitions, and they just move to like a lower rent, lower cost area, don't need to pay much rent, and they play video games and eat Cheetos. Like this is like a documented like phenomena. And now Cohen kind of like tries to say the life, like what kind of like the offer of the threat doesn't need to kind of like necessarily be like a death threat. It can be like a threat to live kind of like a particularly bad life or something. But can we really call these people that kind of like dropped out of the labor force kind of like having a particularly bad life? Now, of course, this kind of like will not apply to some people that have dependence, etc. And of course, like in our system nowadays, like still many people kind of like suffer horrible deprivation, and like economic pressures are like real and normatively significant. But I think because out of the respect to the weight, we kind of like need to come up with like a more nuanced understanding of what exactly they do and how they push us to work, because like the threat of starvation is kind of like not as prominent as functional, I think, as it used to be. But there is also like a more fundamental, like analytic argument can be kind of like analytic problem that can be identified here. So, you know, both in like intuitive understanding of coercion and in like theoretical conceptions of it, like coercion requires some change in the action that you conduct, like after the kind of like coercing action. So if the system coerces us, it needs to make us do something we wouldn't otherwise do. I think this is like really important for like the normative core of like what coercion is. But it's kind of like hard to understand what exactly the system kind of like makes us do, and that kind of like didn't happen in its absence, right? So if you read some of like, again, like maybe some of the radical Republicans we'll get to in a second, like it sometimes sounds like they complain that we kind of like need to toil, to work a lot, like what kind of like maybe if you kind of like hold like a Rousseauian second discourse understanding of like the state of nature, kind of like seems possible, right? Because like Rousseau says like about like the savage that they could like it could satisfy his hunger at the first oak and slacking his thirst at the first brook, all his wants satisfied. But that's like obviously false, right? Because if you look at the anthropological evidence, like most like hunter-gatherers, they had like calorie deficiencies, they probably need to work all the time. And even like in the kind of like much more technologically like advanced context in which we are, like, so like I just saw this like radical community, like eco-village in Ohio called Twin Oaks. So they work 38 and a half hours a week to kind of like enable very basic subsistence. So like work is kind of like, as we said before, it's kind of like it's genesis. It's a general thing that like human need to do to maintain their body. It's not like an invention of capitalism. You can say that like work kind of like made us toil for others, for social requests. And yeah, it's kind of like can be seen, I think, to some degree in the radical Republicans. Like Gurevich has, I think, a little bit of like nostalgia for like kind of like a period in the history of the U.S., kind of like that you had like homestead farms, of course, like kind of like based on like massive like indigenous dispossession and like slavery, etc. But like I think like some idea that we could kind of like, oh, we could gain subsistence like through like what's around us. We didn't need to really get into this complex like social demands system. But that's again false. Again, like this Gurevich system is like a very particular and undesirable system. People always kind of like needed to work with the people around them in order to gain subsistence. And to some degree, you can call it exchange or reciprocity. Like you needed to do, you gained subsistence through the group, and you needed to do something for the group the day after. And we can kind of like think that it's like, I think it's pretty intuitive to think that rearranging it through the market. So now you will need to kind of like do your part through the social demands that come through the market. Like it's not sufficiently clear what exactly changes in the normative picture. Yeah, and like, for sure, like privatization can cause like specific like unfreedoms, like Waldron on homelessness, right? Is like very convincing about like how the way we treat the homeless now kind of like creates specific unfreedom. They cannot physically sleep. They have no place to sleep. But like the argument from privatization doesn't really provide like this criteria of what it is that we need to do now that we didn't need to do in kind of like the counterfactual. But I think the radical Republicans do try to give in their argument some sort of like more specific articulation for why capitalism kind of like requires us to work differently. And they basically say that, I think, because again, it's like a cluster of thinkers, they have like different versions. Sometimes it's pretty hard to understand what exactly they're trying to get at. But like, I think broadly, they try to say that because of the distribution of property in capitalist work, we need to kind of like work in a manner that is somehow controlled by the capitalist class. Now, again, like we can try to understand what more specifically does it mean, and does it like provide like a criteria of difference that is like satisfying enough. So you can say maybe, and again, it's kind of like I think can be read from some of the stuff that they write, maybe that the owners kind of like can really intervene in our labor process and kind of like direct what we do in daily life in our work. I think this again, like this interpretation doesn't really work because at least in large corporations, like the way work kind of like works now, relationship between owners and workers is kind of like defined pretty like strongly through a legal regime that doesn't let owners do a lot with the workers. They kind of like we have like boards of directors, etc., and like a set of institutions that like are meant to make sure that the workers are working basically to maximize profits and not to kind of like be under the discretion, the arbitrary interference of the shareholders or whatever, of the owners. It can be that the owners put managers on us, and those managers kind of like directly, kind of like minutely control us. But then again, we go back to the first kind of like articulation, and we didn't make any progress. I think that the best interpretation is that what they're worried about is that we don't own the means of production, and kind of like work without owning the means of production is somewhat unfree. Now, is the problem rooted in that capitalism is work without owning the means of production? So a few problems with this suggestion. First, like owning the means of production is like really like not an easy like conceptual apparatus, right? Especially like it never was. I think it's hard to like point to any even like historical group and say that they owe the means of production. But especially when we talk in the context of like advanced economies, with like complex global supply chains and credit and financialization, it's going to be very hard to like differentiate between working while owning the means of production and working without owning the means of production. Again, can give a lot of examples, but like let's move on. And even if we take like relatively like clean examples, which I think kind of like most like Republicans will say you do own the means of productions. I'm not sure that like this will satisfy all of our kind of like freedom intuitions. Again, we can go back to the Cristiano example, who do own the means of production, but kind of like seemingly doesn't really enjoy a full implementation of like freedom enabling institutions. Rusali says something like, okay, we need workplace democracy, but to kind of like supplement it with like a much more ambitious like economic democracy, so that the entire structure of investment, etc., will kind of like be directed by the workers. First, it depends on like what exactly this economic democracy means, but it can easily still leave like Cristiano to work on footballs in certain constellations, because even like diffuse like system of like kind of like consumer, they maybe want like kind of like American footballs, and kind of like the distributions of efficiency will still kind of like direct him to do that. But beyond that, like if that's the problem, if the problem is that we don't have this like very far removed ambitious system of like economic democracy, it means first that no workers whatsoever are free right now, and that we are like very, very, very far removed, and like probably will never achieve kind of like freedom for workers, which I think kind of like is another kind of like undesirable kind of like feature of like an answer. But yeah, I think like this idea that like all the workers are like so far removed from freedom, I think is kind of like a little unintuitive. I don't know. We can talk about that. Just say quickly. What time is it? Okay, I'll move quickly. Maybe we can say that the problem is not that the workers kind of like lost something that they used to have, but merely that we do not grant them something that we could grant them now, right? So like that's kind of like already kind of like moving a bit from the coercion argument, but yeah, it's not like a deontic violation, but like freedom is a scalar, and we don't maximize the scalar, kind of like an argument like Van Paris, right? Like we could give people more opportunities, maybe, for example, if work in the market is supplemented by like a thick universal basic income or something like that. And I think it's like a productive direction, like to think that the problem is like less of a violation, but more of like that we can do more for some sort of like clarion like understanding of freedom. But like the Van Paris argument, like its problem is that it's very generic, right? So it will apply to like many systems that don't give people like a maximized amount of opportunities or maximized amount of freedom. I think that we think that there is something particular about markets, about the institutions of capitalism that creates some sort of like unfreedom in the way its institutions work. And like I think that we can say something more specific about like how specific like capitalist institutions kind of like more specifically don't implement liberty in kind of like an ideal manner. And that's what I'm going to try to do now in the second part of the talk. Now, so I think kind of like looking at kind of like our best brains that try to kind of like come up with some articulation of like how capitalism is coercive. I think it's going to be, again, like it's not really that they did like they were not like good enough philosophers in kind of like trying to articulate this particular thing. It's just that it's going to be like a very, very hard thing to do, to identify, I think, a domination or a coercion problem with like the dynamic and diffuse and lucrative system of markets operating to the backdrop of like welfare states. It's not going to be easy. But that doesn't mean that there cannot be like another sort of like freedom problem with markets and with like the way we arrange work right now. So I think we can look at some articulations of like freedom that are kind of like softer, that are not about coercion, and are maybe like somewhat like they are like less dominant in like analytic political philosophy. But I think that they still kind of like connect to our intuitions pretty well, and we can maybe find some inspiration in things more like critical theory, again, that have some softer articulations of freedom, and try to come up with like new articulations that are not about coercion, but still like identify like a way to kind of like ameliorate our like kind of like liberty conditions of workers today. So I'm not going to be able to give like a complete like deductive argument for that, but I'm going to give like a few like attempts to like give some direction of thought related to such conceptions of freedom. Okay, let's start with the little thought experiment. Okay. Ali. Ali sits in his room. He works on his poetry, about which he cares very much. He is rather comfortable and has his basic needs satisfied. Suddenly, Ali hears a knock on his window. He sees a man looking through it. As Ali opens the window, the man quickly tells him, "Look, I see that you're working on something right now, but it would be extremely helpful for me if you'd stop it for a bit and take me to the airport. I need a driver." This in itself doesn't like raise any type of freedom problem, right? Like kind of like suggestions for exchange, for favors from other individuals. They can be annoying, they can be rude, but they're not like a violation of freedom. But now consider the little extra kind of like background context, okay? The man who approaches Ali arrived at his window after seeing a massive government sign that reads, "Please approach this gentleman with your requests." A new state project tries to maximize the number of people who will approach Ali with offers regarding how he should spend his time. As part of it, the main road was diverted to pass beneath Ali's windows. Public shuttle buses depart regularly from all across the city to his backyard, and foreigners get subsidized flight tickets to visiting the city and making offers to locals, among them Ali. Ali needs to tolerate a never-ending stream of strangers who queue and try to move him from what he's doing to other requests. Now, I think that this kind of like institutional environment, I think we will intuitively not see it as an ideal implementation of freedom. I'm going to try to defend this claim a little bit with some kind of like more specific kind of like theories of freedom, etc. later. But let's just say for now that this institutional arrangement that try to maximize the diversion of people from their own conduct, goal, projects, is unideal in terms of freedom. Okay. Now, of course, like the punchline is that Alice Windows is equivalent to the market, right? Because like the market is a huge state project, right? That tries to minimize transaction costs, right? It tries to lower the barriers that can prevent people from coming to you with offers for exchange. This is done, of course, through like kind of like the enforcement of contracts and property rights, but it's done with like way more than that, right? Like governments do a lot in order to break down uncertainty and coordination and trust costs and try to kind of like stimulate trade through markets, right? So we can talk about things like kind of like lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy when kind of like economic activity is a little lower. So kind of like businesses can know that they have more money. If they think that like a contract can be beneficial later on, they can more confidently go and offer these suggestions for trade. Credit scoring kind of like done by registries that work with central banks, also kind of like make sure that businesses has more kind of like confident money for borrowing and stimulating more trade. So like what the government does basically, again, by minimizing transaction costs, is to make it as easy as possible to approach you with offer to trades. And that kind of like it creates a situation. Sorry, I kind of like lost my notes. Like we design basically the system in a way that will allow every new social request that can kind of like pop up to be facilitated to our window and kind of like make us intruded, nagged, begged, and kind of like moved from our own things that we kind of like did before in order to kind of like address some new social demand that kind of like pops up somewhere. And I think many people are kind of like Alice in today's economy in many ways. They're not coerced, they're not forced, but they maybe kind of like had like, they did something that they liked. I don't know, maybe a modest job, career, I don't know, like in journalism or third sector, or like a local theater or something. But they got so many knocks on the windows that eventually at the 10th or like the 100th knock or something like that, they moved to whatever, I don't know, like tech or delivering food through like Uber Eats or like resource extractions in the northern provinces or something like that. I think that our intuitions kind of like hold that people should kind of like be contributive to the society in which they live, right? They should kind of like dedicate some of their time to the maintenance of civilization on kind of like requests that pop up around, but that they should also have some enshrined space of like doing their own thing, right? What markets basically do when we have these kind of like two sides, social requests and kind of like individual conduct, like markets kind of like in a really, really, really strong way empower the social request side, kind of like allow it to kind of like tempt us to do things for the social demand side without giving any type of like explicit weight for the kind of like enshrined individual space. You can say that kind of like markets made us all rich, so now we can kind of like maybe reject some of those offers, but it also made other people rich to kind of like tempt us more. It might be kind of like diminishing returns or something, but like basically there is no explicit expression in our institutions of like this kind of like enshrined individual conduct, I think, space. So Ali enjoys more utility for sure, right? It gets more opportunities for trade that like will kind of like make him richer, etc. But there is like, I think, an overlooked kind of like freedom trade-off vis-a-vis our freedom intuitions. Just like I think it's a bit of a blind spot for like liberal theory. So, for example, like John Stuart Mill, right? He wrote a lot about like the importance of like experiments in living, and how people kind of like part of freedom is to be able to live kind of like eccentric, weird way of life. And he thinks that like various types of social institutions that are not government can kind of like diminish our freedom, right? He writes against, let's say, kind of like public opinion being kind of like very aggressive and trying to move people away from their experiments in living. But Mill was also kind of like, we can debate the extent of like Mill socialism or something like that. I think it's pretty obvious that Mill supported like free markets, and like Mill misses that like free markets are by far the best institution humanity came up with to kind of like neutralize, I don't know, the experiments of people in living young people can kind of like come up, right? Like it's like, oh, like no, we're going to give you like 150,000, whatever, 300, whatever, a large sum of money. So you will basically spend your time doing particular social requests, rather than kind of like pursuing your own kind of like creative individuality. Now, again, I know that this can be a little hard to swallow. I'm going to try to give like 3 additional kind of like auxiliary arguments to try to support that the Ali design is not ideal in our freedom intuitions. I don't think either of these arguments kind of like capture the normative core of what I'm trying to get into. It's kind of like more, again, kind of like showing the different perspectives and different types of like freedom point of views will kind of like largely see this arrangement as non-ideal. So one option that you can look at is the kind of like bargaining literature about spontaneous freedom. So we have this like Gingrich 2022 ethics paper about spontaneous freedom, where he says that part of our intuitive understanding of freedom has to do with feelings of openness, unscriptedness, to be free as a bird, the freedom of the open road, etc. And it looks like quite a lot of philosophers kind of like took up with this argument. Part of our understanding of freedom has to do with this, not necessarily with kind of like negative or liberty or negative or positive liberty, with this, but with this specific thing of kind of like spontaneous behavior. And Gingrich kind of like says explicitly that behavior that kind of like is done in the context of social obligations and kind of like sustained scripts, etc., like work I think is done, kind of like prevents spontaneous freedom. It's not a context in which you enjoy spontaneous freedom. So obviously the Ali design, because it kind of like increases the propensity to take work, you know, side hustle after your 9 to 5. I think it's pretty obvious that like markets do increase our propensity to work. There is the famous Keynes puzzle, right? Like why Keynes believed like 100 years ago that we would work like, I don't remember how much it was, like 15 hours in like something like that. But we don't. We kind of like work similar amount of time to the one we work, to the amount that we worked like a century ago, even though we're so much richer. It's because like markets, again, kind of like tempt us to work more, to spend more time on social demands. And that obviously, again, kind of like at the margin reduces the place for spontaneous freedom. So if you kind of like espouse spontaneous freedom, you're not going to like markets. Second perspective is like the place of leisure in freedom discourse. So I think, you know, even like some, you know, very experienced political philosophers that are, I think in their work are not in a very clear manner under dominating arrangements, may go on vacation, and correct me if I'm mistaken, go on vacation and kind of like say something like, oh, finally I'm free. I think kind of like the place of leisure is like pretty significant in the way we intuitively kind of like perceive the word freedom. And of course, like this is not really comes into like much of an expression in the way freedom is discussed in contemporary analytic political theory. But if you look at the history of political thought, like to a large degree, ancient Greek like defined freedom as freedom from labor, right? And like saw a very, very, very deep connection between leisure and freedom. And there are like various ways in which they kind of like specify that or defended that, like it can be about instrumental action versus kind of like action done for like intrinsic reasons, or like a few different suggestions. I'm not an expert on ancient Greek philosophy, but it's like definitely there. And I think to some degree that kind of like motivates some of these arguments that see toil as the problem of freedom of work, but these arguments will kind of like misconstrued. But that doesn't mean that there is some relationship, that there isn't some relationship between freedom and leisure. I think it's quite intuitive if you think about that. And of course, again, like markets reduce our propensity to leisure, and this would kind of like create some sort of freedom problem as well. And again, kind of like just to say, like, again, in ancient Greece, there was like a kind of like an enshrined institutional place, kind of like protecting this place of leisure, right? Like a lot of like kind of like holidays in which you could not work, kind of like defined like it. So a lot of institutional manifestation for this idea that people shouldn't like kind of like spend their life working. Okay, quickly. Last kind of like auxiliary argument, and I think this one is the most shaky, but let's see what you think. Is less about kind of like the content of what people do with their time, and more about this idea that something softer like incentives or something non-coercive can still kind of like be an institution that violates or somewhat diminishes our freedom. And that's some of the intuition people have about nudge, right? Like this behavioral economic intervention that kind of like tries to shift our architecture of choice. So in a way that doesn't limit our choices, we're still kind of like being pushed toward better options. So, right, like kind of like having a saving accounts as an opt-out option instead of like opt-in, etc. And many people kind of like express some freedom discomfort with nudging, right? So authors suggest that there is something unideal freedom-wise, and I think the government shift the choice architecture around people in the goal of moving them away from their own like modes of rationality or immediate preferences. But like, if it's suspicious that governments make moves to shape the environments, the kind of like preference environment, so that we are more likely to save over not to save, why isn't it problematic that when the government shapes the environment so that we are more likely to take work rather than sit kind of like quietly in our rooms, like writing poetry? I will quickly talk about what it can mean, like implications, what it can mean regarding like having an economy and a labor system with more freedom. And I think it also can kind of like help see what I'm trying to get into. What does it mean to have an economy with more freedom out of this perspective of the freedom problem for it? First, like in principle, if the state kind of like tilts the balance between social requests and a behavior that stems from our own individual wants, maybe you can kind of like level the playing field. It will mean kind of like fortifying a least room, right? So we can kind of like reject more of the social requests and over time kind of like get fewer of them in some way. And again, this comes at the expense of like a utility cost for sure. But I do think it will kind of like, at some margin, it will kind of like make us in a system that's like better in terms of freedom. Now, when political philosophers talk nowadays about like policy tools to intervene in the economy, they often think about universal basic income. So I think kind of like universal basic income gets here the interpretation of something like a way to allow the fortification of a least room, right? Like, so if a least is richer, it can kind of like maybe reject some of the requests. Over time, it will get kind of like fewer annoying or irrelevant requests, and will only get with requests that kind of like more aligned with what he wants to do. But there are many other institutional ways to express, again, like this weight and respect to the idea that like a lot of the behavior people do should stem from their own individual interests. So maybe, for example, when we talk about the funding of arts and sciences, we talk about it out of like considerations of like positive externalities and utility, etc. But maybe governments should kind of like fund the arts because people really like to work in arts, right? And it's kind of like an expression of their own like individuality, etc. So like to give these pockets in which we give more weight to just people doing what they want and not what kind of like social demands, kind of like contribution pushes them to do. Again, this can create, I'm not saying that it's like an all-considered recommendation, but like kind of like a direction of thought. And like we can think of a few other like that, kind of like modest utopias. The modest because all of them are kind of like still in the framework of like a market-based economic system. So for the revolutionaries, it will not go far enough. But there are utopias because they don't take into consideration all of the different complications that for sure and unintended consequences that some of them for sure can raise. So, you know, a kind of like making sure that more people are kind of like not diverted away from what they actually want to do when they're in the economy. It's something we can do not only through the government, but also kind of like through more cultural means, right? So like maybe we should have kind of like more of like an economy of gifts, where you kind of like the next concert you want to go to, you will not go to kind of like the big band that's like already great and like you love and it's like already like very safe in its like a musical career. Maybe you should go to the young band that you're not sure how great of a performance will it be, but that will allow you to kind of like align their incentives with what they actually want to do, kind of like give them a few more years of like trying to live their life as like bandmates instead of like working in finance. Again, like I'm not saying like that all considered you should do that, but something to think about. Maybe like, you know, Google has kind of like an 80-20 famous rule that like workers spend no longer there.
Yeah.
Okay, that's important to know. Oh, that's a shame. So maybe we should have, I don't know, some way. I'm not saying that we should have like a government like regulation that kind of like necessarily like you know, like legislate that or something like that. Maybe we should have more. So the 80-20 rule, for those you maybe don't know, like gave like 20% of time of workers to kind of like work on their own project that they're kind of like interested in. Maybe we should have kind of like more attempt to kind of like push for more arrangements that are like that, and again give more space for individual conduct. I think we can leave it at that and kind of like move. I have a few others, but let's move on to Q&A, etc. Okay. Thank you.